So welcome to the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose here at UCL. I'm the director, Mariana Mazzucato, and I'm so thrilled, stand up, to introduce to you Clara Mattei.
Thank you.
I'm especially thrilled because I feel like even though we don't see each other very often, we have the same history. So she's an associate professor at the New School, but also did her training, her PhD, partly, both in Strasbourg, but also at the University of Pisa, where many of us here at the Institute have very much been in contact with that university, given its central role in kind of new economic thinking around the Schumpeterian and new economics of innovation.
Yes.
So we are absolutely thrilled to have you here because what the Institute tries to do is kind of debunk all the, can we use some bad words, kind of theory which drives a lot of problematic policy. There's a strict link between the policies that many of us know are problematic, austerity being just one, and the theory that has actually allowed it to thrive. And austerity is back. We know it didn't work after the financial crisis, which was caused by too much private debt. We pretended there was too much public debt. And in this country, we embarked on a wave of budget cuts, which at the ground level meant we cut public health, public education, mental health in our schools. And of course, budgets had to fall in order for the leaders to think that we were kind of on the right path. In Europe, as you know, many of the southern European countries, in order to even have access to the loans that were provided at the time around the financial recovery scheme, had to promise, again, to reduce their deficits. And we're from Italy, and what's so ironic is that Italy actually reduced its deficit in order to access the European recovery, and in the process increased its debt to GDP, which is not rocket science. If the denominator doesn't grow and remains at zero, the ratio can go to infinity. X over zero is infinity. So even a mild deficit, and there was a lot of pressure to bring it below 3%. Some countries brought it to 0%. Some countries started to run surpluses, and yet debt to GDP rose. So even on its own logic, it doesn't work. Right. But we're so thrilled to have you because a lot of, the way to fight these problematic policies is to debunk the underlying theory that is driving it. These aren't just wrong because someone woke up one day and did the wrong thing. We believe in the Institute that it's really always important to link that problematic theory, problematic practice. And your book is exceptional. So congratulate Clara. Let's give her a round of applause. I hope you're all going to buy it. Because not only does it make that link in an incredibly forceful way, but it also then links the worst of all worlds, with this fascist kind of political processes, policies, and underlying theory with this big word austerity. And in a country where we are about to embark again on a wave of austerity, this couldn't be more timely. So what we're going to do is give you maximum 30 minutes. Then both Alberto and I, it's a bit of an Italian mafia here, the week that the big mafia boss was actually caught. I shouldn't use that word lightly, sorry. We're Italians, so we're allowed to say it. No one else can say that word. Anyway, we will both just start the questioning with a bit of commentary. I won't do any comments. It'll just be a couple questions, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. I unfortunately have been triple booked today, so I'm going to have to run off at around 7:55, but we have drinks. You're all welcome to stay here until you're kicked out. So without further ado, why don't you begin? I don't know if you need a timer. I can.
No, I have my wallet. Well, you can put the timer just to keep me on track. Okay. So I just wanted to start off by saying that there's a new Oxfam report that came out just in concomitance with the Davos meetings. And just the headline of it is that the richest 1% bagged nearly twice as much wealth as the rest of the world put together over the past 2 years. So inequality keeps rising, it does not stop. And the increase in inequality is the result of what I call in my book the success of austerity. And in fact, we are in a moment, especially in the UK today, that austerity is back with a vengeance. It's not normally used as a term, but it underlines the main tropes of contemporary policies. So the hike in interest rates we are seeing now for more than 6 months all around the globe, together with cuts, especially in the social sector. So the fact that while we're spending more money, of course, in the military sector, there is a constant transfer of resources away from schools, from hospitals, and from all sorts of public benefits. And this goes hand in hand with the third element of austerity. So we talked about monetary, fiscal, industrial, which is fundamentally constant privatization, deregulation of the labor market, and direct attacks on organized labor. So in order to make sense of this fact that austerity is back with a vengeance, it is important to avoid just dismissing it as pure irrationality and figuring out why is it so persistent and why does it shape our lives? In the claim of the book is that it has shaped our life for more than 100 years, and somehow that austerity is actually structural to capitalism. It is actually in the DNA of our socioeconomic system somehow. So the idea here is to repoliticize what austerity is and say, well, of course, as Mariana was pointing out, austerity has not worked in its purported goals of balancing the budget, cutting debt, and boosting economic growth, right? So the objectives that it claims to be trying to achieve, it has clearly not worked, right? It's clearly been wrong in this respect. However, in a way, if we look at it from a lens of class analysis, which is something that few economists do, then we realize that austerity is successful in something much deeper. And it's actually the reason for the title, The Capital Order. The idea is that capital as wealth, capital as GDP growth, requires capital as the fundamental social relation that governs our society, by which we all accept our condition as low-paid wage workers. So in this sense, austerity is persistent because it protects the capital order. It serves as a buffer in moments in which the capital order is challenged. Austerity helps preserve our condition of market dependence, precariousness, thus the possibility of keeping wages low and expectations for profits high. So this is kind of the thesis of the book, is that austerity functions politically to safeguard the foundations of our capitalist socioeconomic system, which is the fact that wage relations and private property of the means of production cannot be contested. And this logic of austerity, which in a way is appearing very clearly, I think, in the UK today. The temporality here is quite obvious. There's been the Great Resignation. There's been actually a huge amount of social upheavals triggered, of course, by the mounting inflation and the reaction. The book came out on the day Chancellor of the Exchequer Hunt announced 300 billions or a huge amount of cuts in the social sector, of course, while the Bank of England was increasing the interest rates. So the idea here is that we need to connect monetary and fiscal policy with industrial policy, labor relation. And if we instead look at monetary and fiscal policy as something separate from our daily lives and the shaping of our human behavior, I think that doesn't really get to why austerity then is constantly used, even if, you know, the center, Mariana's work, the work of many other very important scholars show that it is wrong in the sense that it does not work to increase for its stated goals. So this idea emerges quite clearly if we look at the moment in which austerity emerged for the first time in such clear-cut terms, which is the moment in which capitalism underwent the biggest existential crisis of all. And I'm referring to the years immediately after the First World War. The book begins telling the story of how the Great War, 1914-1918, was a moment of enormous shock for the laissez-faire economic order until that moment, in which state interventionism, more collectivism, the fact that the state actually became the main employer and the main producer, fundamentally shook the idea that private property of the means of production and wage relations were somehow natural givens that were, in a way, facts that no one could challenge. So this fundamental repoliticization of the economic sphere brought about a varieties of practical alternatives from more reformist to more radical. And this is what I do in the first part of the book, is that I reconstruct this full spectrum of experiments, and both theoretical and practical, which called fundamentally for forms of economic democracy of various types. There were the reconstructionists that were kind of proto-Keynesians prior to Keynes, and actually more radical than Keynes in the UK. The book is a comparison between what happened in Italy and what happened in Great Britain. And the reason for this, I will tell you in a bit. But what is clear is that in both countries, the war triggered a reconsideration of the very foundations of our economic system. The book is done all through primary archival sources. So there is data, which you can find in chapter 9, which is, though, fundamentally structured through qualitative reconstruction of the spirit of the time through documents emerging from the Bank of England archives, the Treasury archives, and the newspaper of the time. And of course, I didn't put the page correctly, but I just wanted, if I find it in a minute, otherwise I give up, the type of wording that were kind of everywhere going on. So this is Lloyd George, who was the head of the government in November 1918. He was saying, "We cannot return to the old conditions. War is like a plowshare and a harrow. It has turned up and rent the soil of Europe. You cannot go back." And it's full of all sort of announcements of this necessity for radical change, the fact that there was no way that capitalism was going to survive for more than a couple of years. And this was a sentiment that was shared by the bourgeoisie and by the Times and the Economists, but also, of course, by the radical workers organizing and mobilizing. So I give life to this spirit of the time and look at the Guild Socialist movement, the cooperative movement, the Sankey Committee for the nationalization of coal and self-management of industry through workers' councils, all the way to the case of l'Ordine Nuovo and Gramsci's militant action in Turin in 1919-1920 that provoked the occupation of the factories that took place throughout the whole peninsula in the summer of 1920. So in all of this moment of fundamental claims for economic democracy, of regaining back a say in economic decision-making, of course, a reaction, a very powerful reaction, emerged. And that's what part 2 of the book is all about. It's about the role, especially I focus on the role of economic experts in their position as representatives of the new paradigm of economic which was emerging, the so-called pure economics, that is the outcome of the marginalist turn and the foundation of the neoclassical economic framework, what is still unfortunately dominant today. And what I show is how, for the first time, economists were called at the Brussels and Genoa conference of 1920-1922 to advise governments. And with the governments of the whole Europe, a new financial code based on austerity was put together. And this is what is reconstructed in chapter 5 of the book. And it's amazing how the type of rhetoric used, we have lived above our means, it's all the fault of the fact that workers are just too lazy, there's not enough production, people are consuming too many biscuits. This type of rhetoric, Luigi Einaudi, considered a great anti-fascist, was very much favorable to fascism in the 20s because of its capacity to impose austerity. And his classism over biscuits, sorry, just because I said it, it's like really interesting to actually read what himself, here it is.
You need stickers.
I know, and I've been presenting this book for a while, but I'm so out of it that I can't ever make it. Okay, this is Einaudi in 1920 writing on Corriere della Sera. It is well known that the wages of workers in the industrial and commercial areas of Italy have increased noticeably. The evidence being the conspicuous increase in unnecessary consumption of alcoholic drinks, of sweets, chocolates, and biscuits. And this is just one of the many quotes in which it is clear. Of course, this is Pantaleoni, one of the founding fathers of pure economics with Jevons and Valras. He was even more classist. He says, the notable increase of wages was not accompanied by greater civilization, so that the worker and his spouse lived like pigs in their homes in order to waste the greatest part of their income in wine at the tavern. So these are eminent economists that are still studied today as, the founders of our economic theory. What the effort of the book is to combine what they were writing in their abstract treatise with what they were writing in the press and in their public declarations. And what appears clearly is that the emergence of the expert as this unbiased, above class truth, owner of the truth, came hand in hand with a very classist ambition of disciplining the population by using economics as this apolitical weapon that could tell people you have nothing to contribute here because you're ignorant, you're stupid, leave the economic sphere to the expert. We will tell you what is good for everyone. And of course, the good for everyone, if you look at the data of the time, results in wage suppression, increases in profit shares while the wage share goes down, and surge in the profit rate. So this financial code of austerity, which comes in the form of again, fiscal, monetary, industrial austerity, fiscal being cuts in social expenditures and regressive taxation. At the time, all the ideas of taxing the riches, what we're used to now, the allergy to taxing the riches, was really a turn of events with respect to what was happening immediately after the war, in which the capital levy, the idea of actually really expropriating all the extra profits, was kind of considered normal. And this, in a matter of a couple of years, is completely reversed in favor of taxing through consumption taxes. So indirect taxation as, of course, the quintessence of regressive taxation, hand in hand with monetary austerity, increasing interest rates, which in Britain caused a recession. So this is the whole point, is that it was known that the increase in interest rates would cause a recession. But this was kind of somehow politically intelligent, because it caused an increase in unemployment rate, which of course meant that, and this I have all the graphs, showed that this meant a complete appeasing of industrial arrest. All the strikes stopped because of this increase in unemployment rate. And this is Michael Kalecki telling us clearly that the disciplinary mechanisms of increasing unemployment is what guarantees the end of the questioning of wage relations and the acceptance of lower wages. So while in Britain, what happens was that the governments in power followed the advice of the experts who are the protagonists of my book, Ralph Hawtrey, the in-house economist at the British Treasury, who had an enormous influence also on the Chicago School of Economics later on, with all the controllers of finance who were the bureaucrats who were directly advising the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so the people who were not elected, but were actually forming the economic models that then were so influential in the austerity policymaking. In Britain, it was about tweaking the dials of macroeconomic management that induced a recession, which ultimately appeased the population. And this, I would just like to read you guys a quote from G.D.H. Cole. G.D.H. Cole was a guild socialist, active, militant intellectual at the time. He saw what was going on very, very sharply. He says, he writes in 1925, once the doldrums, as Pigou put it, had begun, this economic stagnation induced by austerity. The big working class offensive had been successfully stalled off, and British capitalism, though threatened with economic adversity, felt itself once more safely in the saddle and well able to cope, both industrially and politically, with any attempt that might still be made from the labor side to unseat it. So he makes it very clear that if we look at austerity from a point of view of class relation, austerity may not be good in stabilizing the economy, but it's very good at stabilizing class relations. So again, the short-term cost of economic downturn for a longer-term gain of securing the capital order, which is kind of what is most important if we want to safeguard capitalism, even at the cost of an economic recession. So while this form of economic coercion was what wielded the return of consensus for the system in Britain, in parallel, the book looks at what was happening in Italy. And in Italy, what is for me important here about the comparison is that I wanted to look at two countries that both from an institutional and an ideological point of view cannot be understood as more, different, right? That pulls apart cradle of parliamentary liberalism, advanced economic empire, Great Britain, and on the other hand, the birthplace of fascism in Italy. And what you see if you take the lens of austerity is that the treatment, both countries and the economic experts advising the state, were really treating their citizens very, very similarly. So while in Britain it was again more about economic coercion, even if again laws were passed to suppress strikes, for example, emergency acts of the type we're seeing, by the way, today again, it seems, in this country. In Italy, the force of the state, of course, in imposing law and order was stronger because we well know that the fascist dictatorship implied the torture, the jailing, and the killing of political opponents. Nonetheless, austerity operated very effectively in both countries in a very, very similar way with very, very similar results, which I show also empirically. Now, not only were the parallelism in these supposed opposite worlds so obvious in terms of economic policymaking and ideology backing the policymaking, there is also another striking fact, which I analyze in chapter 8 of the book. And chapter 8 of the book makes me most proud because it's the book that the chapter in which I act most as a historian by reconstructing everything from scratch, because there's nothing on this topic, which is how supportive of Mussolini's regime the whole British liberal elite was in the 1920s, because Mussolini was the best student of austerity in those years. So I went into the archives of the Treasury and the Bank of England, and what you see is quotes such as, and I can even end here if we want to keep it real brief, so then I can expand later, but quotes such as the one of Montagu Norman. Montagu Norman was the head of the Bank of England. And in 1926, after the Leggi Fascistissimes had passed, so after actually Mussolini had shown the full-blown violent face of fascism, he writes to Jack Morgan of J.P. Morgan Chase, again, very supportive financially also of Mussolini's regime. Fascism has surely brought order out of chaos over the last few years. Something of the kind was no doubt needed if the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the other direction. The Duce was the right man at a critical moment. Like him, and again, this is the thing that it seems like I exaggerate when I tell the story, but the book is all done through the words of the protagonists themselves, because I think it's the words they use and then also the events that happen that really give a sense of the violence of austerity and this anti-democratic thrust of austerity that is still clearly obvious to this day. So, the ambassador of Great Britain was so happy. He was just saying, strikes are over. Finally, savings are back up. The deficit has been solved. Now, Italy is finally in a situation by which we can finance the Italian state, to go back to the gold standard. In fact, we received many loans thanks to the austerity, and of course the parallelism with what happens with the IMF in countries today is quite obvious. So the typical case of Augusto Pinochet in Chile with the Chicago Boys in the 70s is not the first case of the whole international liberal establishment supporting authoritarian governments once it's about economic efficiency to suppress what is considered a restless population, such as the Italian one after the First World War. I think I can stop here, and then there's much else, but we can.
Okay,
Thanks.
Thank you. Oops. So I'm just going to prompt her a bit, then Alberto will as well. Alberto, in fact, join us, please, here. And then we're going to open it up. So I was actually going to ask you a different set of questions until you mentioned Mussolini. I'll just say what the first question is, but you don't have to answer it because I'm sure it'll sort of come up, which is you talk about, Pareto and Einaudi and kind of like the traditional Italian and not only theorist who their thinking kind of underpinned what we're calling austerity today. My question is, given a lot of the dysfunctional policies we have today, including this kind of automatic idea that you just raise interest rates and somehow that's going to reduce inflation when the real issue is inequality in terms of wealth concentration, this idea of excess profits that should be taxed but aren't, where are the traditional economic theorists that you think are most in some ways responsible for this lack of attention today, like naming, not so much about naming and shaming individuals, but the bits of neoclassical economics, because that's a big word, neoclassical economics. There's strands within neoclassical economics that one could look at as justifying these problematic policies today, which don't take into account issues around inequality, wealth concentration. You mentioned the Oxfam report, but literally this idea of excess profits and rents being at the core.
Yeah.
Okay, I was going to ask that, but I'm not. I will, sort of, not really. Mussolini. So one of the things Mussolini also did is very much against actually a lot of the stuff that you talked about. So setting up the Istituzione della Ricostruzione Italiana, the famous IRI, a big state-owned enterprise. That's kind of in the opposite bucket that we would usually have put austerity. In fact, Liz Truss's government, they were blamed for having, begun with these policies of reducing taxes for the rich, introducing austerity, but they were very explicit also on deregulation, union bashing, but also privatization, which wasn't talked about actually when people said, oh yeah, finally the financial markets are punishing them. So isn't that a bit of a oxymoron, right? That we have on the one hand someone who, as you say, is kind of justifying and is embedding austerity at the deep level, Mussolini, but who's also very pro-statist in the sense of investment and public ownership and public enterprise. If you can just say something about that,
yes.
Then we'll move on to
yes,
Alberto. Because it is, you didn't mention that.
Thank you. So the phase in which Mussolini does put together IRI matters because it's a moment in which the capital order in the country had already been regained through austerity. So I think this is very important because actually the polemic against what was called le bardature di guerra, so kind of the overstepping of the state in taking over many of the the private sectors during the war was something that was a campaign that was really at the forefront of all liberal economists and fascist economists alike in the early 20s. So really the reuniting under we need to privatize. And actually Mussolini undertook, there's a very good article focusing on this by Branca, I think, I don't know, it's cited in the book, in which he says it's actually the biggest large-scale privatization campaign in modern capitalism, happens in Italy in the 20s. Everything is privatized until 25, 26. And this is very important because, of course, it increases the market dependence of workers. The first thing Mussolini does is actually fire 63,000 public employees with the idea that in this way you can... In this way, you can achieve what still someone like Alberto Alesina was writing a couple of years ago, which is you can lower the reservation wage of the workers and make sure that everyone accepts competing in the private market and thus gets disciplined by this market. right? So there's this first page of privatization that I think is very, very important in securing the end of industrial unrest because it disempowers the workers. And following that, then I think there is a space for the state to intervene economically without this causing political unrest. While already in 1919, 1920, also when the British government was actually wanting to maintain state intervention, actually wanted to increase nationalization, like in the case of coal, the famous Sankey Committee. What you saw there is that these reformist objectives were actually achieving results that were not reformist at all because the demand for more radical social change were being further in a way triggered. So if that makes sense, is that I think there are limits of when the state can intervene to make it not a politically dangerous circumstance. So I think it's only when Mussolini is sure that the wages are repressed by decree in 1926 and 1927 with the labor charter that you can then go on and ultimately think about increasing productivity also through state interventionism. In fact, I think last thing I want to say is that there is a sense in which, and I think again this is because historians usually tell stories that are very congenial to maintaining consensus for the present, and it's incredible because we're used to thinking of economists as having a big political role. Historians have just as much of a political role in telling us a story about the past that really informs and forecloses our imagination for the future, in my mind. And what is clear, for example, to give an example, the fact that usually you associate fascism with corporatism. And you understand corporatism as something very different from the market economy that is, typical of our current state of affairs, or in a way, just to simplify. But the point is that corporatism is seen as a beast of its own. And this is a problem because then fascism is, you say, well, there's the liberal phase of fascism, which is the austerity phase, but that's not really fascism. Fascism comes later in the form of corporatism. But actually, if you see, the only element of continuity in fascist economic policies is wage repression and prioritizing private investors. What Meloni today are extreme right government calls the real producers. The producer is not the worker anymore. That's again something that's clear in the economic model, right? It's the saver investor who becomes central, and the real producer is the private investor. So the corporatism was never challenging private investors as central to the economic machine. Then the idea was that the state could help and take a role, but you would never challenge wage relations and private property of the means of production, and wage repression remains a constant even when forms of greater interventionism are put into place.
Very interesting. Alberto.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, because this was the incentive to read the book, which was for a long time in my to-do list, and eventually I did. And this said, I need to confess, because I'm an economist, I do formal macro models, therefore supposedly telling us the truth, and I'm also Italian. So if we read the book, you could get very upset with the support that economists gave to fascism and authoritarian governments. And thank you for inviting me, because it was very stimulating and interesting. And because, as you said, going back through the history help us to understand a bit better what is going on right now and some current topics, I would say. So the relationship between democracy, economic democracy, and the technocrats. And perhaps also understanding a little bit better some decision taken right now by monetary institutions, the decision to increase the interest rates, and so on and so forth. Reading the book, I want to raise this point and discuss with you this point. So I do fully agree with you that austerity, the trinity of austerity, fiscal austerity, monetary austerity, and industrial austerity, is absolutely consistent, I would say, with the fundamentals or the backbones of capitalism. So the private ownerships of the means of production, wage relationships. But then reading the book, it came to my mind also all the discussion about the many different forms of capitalism. So capitalism is not always the same. The backbones probably yes, definitively yes, but not the many different forms that capitalism took through decades. Even thinking at what you mentioned directly in the book, the proposal coming from the reconstructionist. So the idea of reforming capitalism, giving capitalism a nicer face, if you want, and including to some extent workers into capitalism. There have been the golden age of capitalism in which policies implemented were precisely going in the opposite direction with respect to what austerity is right now, or it is meant to be right now. So I'm wondering whether, and very interesting, you also mentioned the U-turn in Keynes' mind, in Keynes' view. Keynes was a supportive of austerity at the time, and then there was the Keynesian revolution coming after the outbreak of the Great Depression. So I'm wondering, accepting, and I fully agree with you, that austerity could be the safeguard of the fundamentals of capitalism, if it is not possible to develop capitalism or to change capitalism with much more inclusive stance. Because this was what happened in the end, in the 30 years after the end of the Second World War. One tricky issue is to understand whether the so-called golden age of capitalism was the exception rather than the rule. One could say, okay, that was the exception and not the rule. So I would like to raise this point with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the intention here is exactly to try to shake a little bit of what is the common sense understanding that the problem is neoliberalism, and that neoliberalism is the exception, and it's we can revert to a more humane face of capitalism. I really think that if one looks at history through the lens of austerity, what you can see is not only that Keynes ultimately was Keynes was someone who was very politically aware, and he realizes still in 1942, so after he writes the general theory and has, repudiated Say's law, and so criticized the treasury view and all of this, he is someone who really says, if I had to go back, I would inflict the same dosage of your money that in my book, I went through the archives. He was advocating for a 10% interest rate in 1920, so even higher than what the Bank of England was doing. And this, because I think ultimately Keynes is someone who, even if he likes to, portray the economy as something that has to do only with technical matters, and that's why ultimately he is also very much favorable to one of the pillars of austerity, which is central bank independence. And I discussed, the origins of central bank independence, which is while in Italy you had fascist cabinet expelling any political participation in economic decisions, in Great Britain it was about protecting the Bank of England as an independent institution and actually exporting the central bank independence in other countries. In India, Basil Blackett, one of my protagonists, goes to India to establish an independent central bank. Otto Niemeyer, the other controller of finance, goes to Brazil and to establish a central bank that is independent there, with the idea, of course, what we hear all the time, which is only central bank independent central banks can actually be more inflation averse than any other actor, right? And this is exactly, but I think this is important also to answer your question. The ECB is the most independent central bank, both politically in the sense that it explicitly forbids to receive any instruction from either community or national political institutions. And this is Article 7 of its constitution. But it's also economically independent in the sense that it has no obligation to finance the member nations' public deficits, right? So the ECB is the best embodiment of central bank independence. And central bank independence is, of course, the idea that in this way we have safeguarded the key decision-making processes in the hands of the experts and away from the people. And there's other ways in which you can de-democratize the economy. For example, as in Italy right now, we have introduced the balanced budget clause in our constitution. So different ways, but certainly central bank independence is a very important way of securing austerity as the norm. And going back to Keynes, Keynes was someone who really saw the importance of excluding the general public from economic decisions and keeping it in the hands of the expert. And this is something that he saw very clearly when he was confronted with the revolutionary potentials that were emerging after the First World War. So even once he changes his theoretical framework, he himself says there is a class war and I'm on the side of the educated bourgeoisie, and this is just his position, and this is, quoting him directly. So he never kind of hid where he stood in terms of the class struggle. And I think in a way this speaks to the fact that when it comes to safeguarding what someone like Jeff Mann in his book on Keynes calls the fragile crust of bourgeois civilization, then Keynes is pro-austerity, right? So again, I think there's a space to be Keynesian once this general social order is secured. Then you can be Keynesian within certain limits, of course, because then if monetary instability is high or the balance of trade is bad because you're importing too much, because you're doing too much social expenditures, then you got a problem there. So either you find other ways to cure these. So of course you can.
There's a parallel in what you just said, though, right? With what you said about Mussolini
yes,
and Keynes.
I
Both
think
of
so.
them,
I think so.
The social order can be progressive.
Exactly. So I think that's kind of the thing. So in this sense, I need to. The next project is to look at the golden age through this lens, and I think what you can see and what I've already started seeing is actually that. If you look at what happened in the United States after the Second World War, the Keynesian experts advising for example, in the Council of Economic Advisors in the United States, they were Keynesians, self-proclaimed Keynesians, and actually more radical than the new Keynesians that came after. But in a certain way, they use Keynesianism to, for example, keep very high surpluses in moment of economic growth. So paradoxically, there's a very good book written, by the way, by a very conventional scholar. Now I forgot his name, but he shows that how actually Keynesianism meant higher surpluses during the golden age because of the fear of inflation. So the fear of inflation that constantly hunts austerity experts is a fear that actually is quite shared in those years by the Keynesians. And so what I'm saying is that I think there's reasons to try to at least criticize or look maybe a little bit differently to this supposed idealized years that we kind of take for granted. Oh, those were moments. And plus, it was a golden age for the very small minority of countries in the west of the world. Italy, for example, never did Keynesian policy after the second. We had Luigi Einaudi, who was like explicitly anti-Keynesian, the Bocconi boys had a role from very early on in a way in Italy. So again, I think there's nuances, and I would say we should maybe rethink a little bit of how we take for granted that the golden age was golden, what it meant for it to be golden, and it was golden for whom exactly. So in that sense, of course, that's why it's not really a conventional historical reconstruction, but I think this is the idea of coming up with a book that tries to, give some tools to maybe question what is normally taken for granted. And of course, it's neither all black nor white. There's elements of complexity, of course, but I think maybe this lens can help us also rethink some of our assumptions.
Okay, we're going to open it up in just a minute. I just wanted to come back to the question that I said I wasn't going to ask. I'm going to ask it, but in a different way. Your book, when did you hand in the manuscript? What month?
A while back.
Right, so that's sort of the point. In the meantime, a lot has happened, and our common friend Isabella Weber, who also got a PhD at the New School for Social Research, as I did, where you're now teaching, has been on kind of a mission to precisely do what you're doing, but around the inflation and this kind of resistance to price caps that even Krugman said that's a folly, only a stupid economist would ever, ask for that. He now says, whoops, sorry, you're actually right. How would you have maybe even rewritten the preface or the introduction if you were submitting it today, given what we've seen in the last 6 months with the way that economics as a profession has resisted, this alternative way, coming back to the point about, excess profits, rents, and so on, where the kind of economic theory bottlenecks are. Like, how would you have written a motivation for writing this book relating neoclassical economics to not just austerity, but everything that's going around austerity now?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was quite lucky because it speaks more to us right now than maybe a couple of years ago when I wrote. But this is, for example, Lawrence Summers on the Bloomberg Wall Street Week, March 5, 2021. The Federal Reserve needs to remember that their priority is the macroeconomy. When I see them say that they won't raise rates until diversity groups' unemployment rate are appropriate, I get nervous. If they take inflation seriously, monitor it closely, and are prepared to cause pain, they will be able to control inflation. So I think this is kind of the go-to narrative that has even boosted further in these last years, is the idea that inflation is a problem and there is no alternative but imposing your money. And this is obvious to how Isabella Weber has been really attacked brutally because of the idea that, hey, even the United States during and after the Second World War were imposing price caps, and this doesn't require necessarily a revolution or a general, in the words of my book, a general disorder of the capital order. You could, there's, so I think in this sense, that it proves the case of how the objective of curing inflation and balancing the budget is really somehow less important, or often used as a pretext to a much deeper problem that Larry Summers is pointing out in this quote and still right now, which is, hey, the labor market is too tight. The labor market is too tight. People are not going back to work. There is a huge problem with the Great Resignation. There is a big anti-work movement in the United States emerging. There are strikes in sectors that until very recently had been completely deregulated, right? The new unions, Amazon, Starbucks, whatever. This is a moment in which this is why there's no option but deflation and no other kind of ways to cure inflation, because we got to discipline the people to go back and allow us to avoid cost of labor being too high, because otherwise our economy is not going anywhere and we are in trouble. So I think there's a sense by which the austerity economists are aware and are making quite explicit in the words they're using, even someone like Jerome Powell, I believe, of what is really at stake right now, which is this disorder of capital as a social relation. And I think this is true also in Britain right now. I mean, if it's all about balancing the budget, then you could do it by increasing taxes on the wealthy, especially in a moment in which the wealthy have, again, like possessed so much of circulating value at this moment. Or, even right now, the fact that they're not reaching an agreement with there's right now the polemic, because actually this railway strike has been really expensive. And so why, it's illogical if it's about really saving money, then just get it. But there's something deeper. You don't want to reach an agreement because it's a political point. Like you can't have it so that you can't give them greater rights, because then maybe they'll ask for more and then we're going to be screwed. So I think here it's the point, like inflation and debt are used often as a way to tell us there is no alternative. This is, a natural necessity. Of course, you need to be prudent and realistic. And it's synonymous with the economic policy is austerity. If you ask any economist, it's not even called austerity, but it's just like, it's what the economists tell you to do. But ultimately, I think there is a rationale that is deeply political. And I think, then there's other elements again of the story, but I just want to stress that this element, especially if we are economists and political economists, we need to keep in mind that there's always, and Keynes knew this very well, inflation was never only an economic problem, it was a deeply political problem. He has many quotes that I cite in the books, and this I'll stop talking, in which he says, if you debauch the currency, you debauch the whole capitalist system generally. Inflation is causing a problem at the basis of contract of capitalism. And this he was seeing clearly. And that's why the only way out was inflation. Deflation. Because inflation is not just an economic problem, as we are seeing right now in the UK, I feel.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
May I add one more point?
And then we're going to open it
if
up.
you don't mind, which is precisely related to what you said, because it is related to the relationship between economic democracy and technocrats. Because obviously what central banks are doing, central banks as the clearest example of technocrats are doing is clearly to make workers pay the cost of an exogenous increase in inflation. So they are saying it very clearly even. So they would like, they don't want to do so, but they are eager to give rise to a recession in order to stop any possibility of a price-wage spiral. That's clear. And to some extent, they are forced to do so because this is even enshrined in their mandate. So you mentioned the ECB, they have to keep inflation at 2%, so there's no way out of this. And this is clearly the best way to keep out of people the power to make decisions about economic policies. And it's clear that any kind of economic policy is a political decision. No doubt about that. My reflection coming out of reading your book is that, however, the relationship between technocrats and economic decision and economic democracy is very tricky, because in the end, we come out of 2 years in which some decisions taken by policymakers and politicians have been highly informed by scientists or technicians. And this should bring us to how to define this relationship between experts in some sectors, technocrats, economics or rocket science, and political decision. My impression is that there should be a dialogue between them, provided that some crucial values are included in our constitutions and they are intangible. I mean, they cannot be touched, and those values hopefully are as much progressive as possible. Because otherwise, final point, if we want to talk about economic democracy, there has been in several countries in the last year some electoral results which have been very disappointing from the point of view of progressive people. The US, Brazil, and elected people, they have freedom or they have the right, because they have been elected through some mechanism. I'm not talking about the mechanism, to take their own decision. What happens if Trump decides to make a very regressive change in the taxation system? He has been elected. And, but that decision goes precisely against some principle, some values, and this is an example of economic democracy, however, because he has the power, it has been elected.
Saying that the United States is an example of economic democracy is a bit problematic, in the sense that there's no democracy whatsoever in the United States.
I'm not entering...
I'm keen to bring in the audience, so just finish what are you good?
Yeah, I'm good, just for the general discussion.
No, it's very...
Okay.
Did you want to respond, or
No,
should
no,
we? I think we should open up. Why don't we take 2 or 3 questions? Do you have a piece of paper to write? Should I give you a piece of paper?
I can.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, she's younger than I am.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, but I think we need to do first here and then some. Yeah, so should we do 2 and 2? Or I would say we do 3 first, answer, and then we can do a couple, yeah? Okay, so I'm going to try to mix also gender and all sorts of other things. So we're saying 1, 2, and 3. I don't see any women.
They're all guys.
They're all guys. Jesus Christ. Yeah. So why don't we start with you?
Hi.
And if
We
just
still
remember
listen
them,
to
yeah?
you.
We'll do 3. Yeah, we'll still listen to you.
Is it working?
It's just online.
Okay, sure. So my question is a little bit
Oh,
related.
maybe if you can just say your name and
Oh, yes. My name is Antonio. I'm Spanish and I've been here for 3 years. It's a little bit related what we were speaking about. It's more about social democracy versus socialism, sort of. And I was listening to this political commentator, David Pacman, and he had Yanis Varoufakis in one of his channels, right? And he asking about, hey, some of us on the left, we don't want to go all revolutionary, and we want to sort of make capitalism a little bit more human. Now, Yanis Varoufakis shut him down, saying, hey, this is not going to happen anymore. It's not possible. And Yanis argues that now value creation and the source of value comes mostly from the financial sector. Financial institution, financial products, and all that thing, right? Back in the past, maybe you can sit down with factory owners, and he's what he thinks is that economic value was coming from factories and for products and for things that you can, I don't know, real value and you can measure. Since now, not only power, but value creation has shifted to the banking sector, we don't really have the tools to do anything anymore, because even if you want to regulate them, they're way ahead of you, right? Like, how do you regulate Facebook? How do you regulate all these things? That's my question. Just, I want to know her opinion, but also, what's the way to go from here?
Great, awesome. Why don't we go to that side, and then we'll come back here.
Thank you.
Oh, maybe. Daniel.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My name's Dan. I'm a research fellow at IPP. It was great to hear the kind of 3 pillars of austerity, and I think most of the time you hear austerity and you think about the fiscal version,
Right.
so it was great to hear you kind of elaborate on those 3. I'm interested in what you think kind of an economics of anti-austerity looks like, in particular in the monetary sphere. So I think in the fiscal sphere, you can imagine it quite easily. It's kind of continued expenditure. It's maybe MMT, I don't know, you can get into that. In the industrial sphere, it's supporting kind of or unionization or workers' rights. In the monetary sphere, if there is a kind of high inflation environment, what is an anti-austerity economics response? Is it to allow that to continue? Are there other ways of kind of dealing with inflation? Would be interested to hear you elaborate on that.
Okay, thank you. I'm making it harder for the mic. Sorry, going back and forth. Jake, and then we'll have answers, and then Carolina, if there's some women on the line, that'd be good. Yeah. Okay, good.
Jake Sumner, and I think I'm an honorary fellow here. I think you've really well articulated the political choices around austerity, and I just hark back to the ragged trouser philanthropist, which I sort of dipped into the other day, and it's all the same arguments are being made then, and about how important capital is to create all the wealth and suppression of wages and everything. So it's existed for some time, and it's resurgent now. And all the things that people have said, unions, etc. I've written a paper on this myself around how important they are to try and stabilise and increase wages, terms and conditions, and it's no wonder that they are attacked and tried to be suppressed. What I didn't quite understand, though, and it's in your title, is the connection with fascism, because obviously it was primarily 2 examples. You're trying to compare Britain and Italy, and a couple of other things were thrown in, but surely there's in the move to fascism, you create the environment for it, but then it's the othering of people's, it's their fault. Look at them, look at that. As it was, for example, Jews in Germany or others. And obviously it was not an initial process in Italy, but then it did come to that, and you see that now. Blaming immigrants for taking jobs, etc., etc., etc. So isn't that you create the environment through austerity, then it's the othering, and then unfortunately now fueled with social media, fueled with a media that pushes some of that, particularly in Britain, and then you get the toxic mix, which the last speaker has just said may lead to some of those outcomes in democracies where people think their own economic interests are best served by preserving austerity.
Good.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Maybe
defining fascism too.
Yeah, so fascism fascism is, again, one of those words that are used very extensively. How I use it is in the historical sense of the regime of Benito Mussolini after the First World War in Italy, which is kind of historically fascism, how it was realized and the emergence of the term and the Movimento dei Fasci. It's interesting because I think by looking critically at the emergence of fascism in Italy, what you see is, again, a narrative that goes against our canonical understanding of the relation between austerity and fascism. In the sense, and actually the title of the book, I think, misleads a bit. but it was the publisher was very keen on keeping it, so I was like, okay, because it can be read differently. But anyway, the point is that usually we think about the German case, and there's recently a pretty good article was just published to show how it was, throughout the 20s, major austerity was imposed on Germany, also because of the problem of reparations, and again, this pressure from the international technocratic movement, also again coined during the Brussels and Genoa conference, imposed austerity on Germany, and thus in a way Hitler arose also because of this kind of anti-austerity a sentiment that though had basically completely disempowered the workers, right? So it was not really it was kind of the typical what we see right now, I think, with Meloni in power in Italy, is that you see that the fact that she was elected, even if the majority of Italians, many Italians didn't vote at all. So the party that won in Italy was the non-voting party, just to be clear, because people are just really disillusioned right now. The result of austerity is also that people think in a way that Meloni is the way out of austerity because she was the only one to have a few words critical of the Troika and a program. If one read the program prior to her election, it was quite an ambitious program of social expenditures, especially for families, and a natalist cause of actually increasing money for preschools and whatnot. Okay, so it was actually quite a socially expansive program, and she was the only voice out of the choir critiquing Draghi, for example, who was kind of like the embodiment of the austerity kind of lineage, following Monti and all the Bocconi boys. So kind of Meloni coming to power and Hitler coming to power, because people are trying, once disempowered and really frustrated, try to find an alternative in what then figures out to be, in case of Italy for sure, different the story of Germany, but in case of Italy for sure, then a reverse back to austerity. Now, Meloni was able to even really started what is one of the most austere campaigns of all, which is the war against the poor and the workers, saying, that the lazy people shouldn't get their reddito di cittadinanza, so the income of citizenship. And Meloni is doing very hardcore austerity in the last budget she was able to pass. So the point here being that actually, if you look at what happened with the originating moment of fascism emerged because people were worried about Bolshevism and about an alternative to capitalism. So Mussolini came to power not with the coup, but called by the king to resolve a political crisis, and with the support of liberals, or Partito Popolare, of a series of other parties that were saying, hey, we have a political crisis, there is a serious threat of a revolutionary momentum, we need to block this, okay? So Mussolini came to power because he represented the possibility of repacifying the population within the capitalist order through austerity. Okay, so here the story, the original story of fascism is very different. Fascism was the embodiment of austerity throughout the 20s, one could say. And this is really why it paved the way to fascism, in the sense that you can read it as it fortified the fascist regime, because we very well know that people, it's not like Mussolini came to power and everyone like, okay, now we're under a regime. Regime takes years to gain strength, gain political legitimacy, and the political legitimacy it achieved from someone like Luigi Einaudi and all the liberals in Italy, as well as the liberals abroad, really helped strengthen his rule to the point that, he became a full-blown dictator. So this, I think, is a story that usually not told. Again, I think because it's more congenial for the present state of affairs to say fascism is like, it's like when people get power and then vote against their interest, or like, like something that is like, in a way, the idea of dissociating fascism from free market capitalism, while we very well know that actually they went hand in hand, at least in Italy in the 20s. And Wall Street, there's a very good work of Gian Giacomo Migoni about specifically Wall Street through JP Morgan Chase, informally supporting Mussolini economically and politically. One, the United States were still in a kind of a mood of not intervening necessarily, still a protectionist move. So they were just beginning to become the creditors on a world scale, but they were not really in the mood of intervening formally in the affairs of Europe. What is clear is that the bridge, Migone speaks about how the bridge to American hegemony was actually Mussolini through the financial sector and supporting him. So we see how kind of the connection between fascism and kind of market capitalism is very strong from the very beginning. So that's for the first answer that I went a little bit long on. On the second one, well, interesting what Varoufakis says. I would be more of the idea of what Robert Brenner says, who has been analyzing this historical moment in a way that I think is effective, which is about like this return of like kind of a feudal situation by which no value is really produced any longer. It's just being appropriated. So kind of, and this is something that studying with Duncan Foley or other economists at the New School is something that clearly comes from Marxian understanding of how our economic system works, in the sense that, of course, the value is produced at the level of production through exploitation of labor, while the financial sector is just about appropriation of this value in circulation, right? So that's just, it depends on the theoretical framework, but I would go more, if, according to my kind of economic understanding with this analysis, the way forward that connects to the idea of a just a few words. I'm not the best, the best one on this, but you can read a lot of also what just James Galbraith has been writing about the possibilities of various forms of price caps on goods. And then, of course, with the whole discussion about why we have inflation. And while the Austerians that I describe in the book, of course, attributed to the success of consumption from the general public, so the inflationary spiral coming out of an overconsumptionist model, we have, of course, many other readings that can go from someone like Robert Reich, who's more into the idea of forms of oligopolies, to I think also more interesting readings of just about how the markets on profits are very political. If you read someone like Rick Wolff or James Galbraith himself, right? So in that case, of course, then if it's about how you understand the origins of inflation, then you could solve inflation in ways that clearly require political intervention in actually curbing the power of those who actually decide on the level of prices, and not instead, kind of, again, diminishing the consumption power of the general public. But that's and the way forward. I'm profoundly anti-capitalist, and this is, I think it came out very clearly from the discussion, and I know that we have different understandings here. So I think there's very little leeway if we want to maintain the general framework. This said, I also think that there is a problem in how we understand revolution in our mind. Again, a category that has been deeply affected by how historians have told the past of the 20th and 21st century. Revolution doesn't have to be like the bloodshed, and there's revolutionary, as I described in the first part of the book. In Britain, it was revolutionary ends through constitutional means, and there's many understandings now of the importance of neighborhood councils, that gaining back agency of people who are ultimately don't even recognize themselves as workers anymore, but who participate in forms of decision making that could really concretely show us alternative ways forward. And I don't think one can just have a template that is abstract, but we need to kind of like be living the moment. That's what is so cool about the l'ordine nuovo that I described, is that while you live processes, you also can start thinking about new processes, right? So I think that action and thought go together, and that's why I'm not going to tell you, this is the way forward, but that, just to get us thinking.
Just
I am unfortunately going to have to go because I've been triple booked and I'm going to one of these neighborhood associations
Good.
that has been massively affected by
It's very
austerity
important.
in support. I'm also going to give you our book that just came
Thank
out,
you so
which
much.
blames McKinsey for everything, actually.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
And I'm going to pass over to Carolina, but thank you so much.
Thank you,
This
Mariana.
work is so important, especially in debunking a lot of the myths.
Right, exactly.
Like that fascism only arises when everyone is just, without any hope. This kind of intricate structural relationship between austerity and fascism is super original. So
Thank you.
you
Thank
for
you so
coming
much.
here, and we hope
Thank
to see you
you.
back. So
Yeah,
I will
thank
go
you.
out quietly. We can begin while I go out.
Okay, so let's get two questions from the.
Thank you for the book. Very happy. It's very light too. Cool.
So before we go back to the audience, let's get two questions from our online audience. We had over 100 people online. So yeah, that's great. So we have one about the ECB from Patricia Pino Argumedo. Hope I'm pronouncing her surname right. So does the ECB hold ultimate accountability to the European Parliament or the European Commission? Do these bodies have the power to instruct the ECB to finance deficit, or can the ECB refuse even under such instruction? Is it okay? Do you want me to repeat?
Just the very first part. Which one is it?
Patricia.
Yeah.
And should I try one more?
Yes.
So we have one, I think it's more existential from Roberto Campbell. But I think actually, let's see how we're going to approach that after this Marxist discussion a little bit. So so Roberto Campbell, he's asking us, I'm constantly asked by my less engaged colleagues, why? Why is the right trying to hold more wealth? Why, etc.? How can I succinctly explain what's going on the right now? And how that relates to impeding the catastrophe of climate change. I think that's change, yeah. So this is like more existential, as I said. So 2 questions here. Should we go to the audience, like another 2? Yes, one more. So do you want to go first? Oh, I think, Angelo, you need to... Did you get the question?
Need to reread the ECB one, but yeah.
So if you can go, that was the 2 women,
Hello, thank you for the fantastic talk. My name is Nai. I'm a PhD student at UCL at IPP. And so I'm really, really glad to hear tonight's discussion. I can't help but think of some of the interlinkages between fascism and colonialism. Mm-hmm. You mentioned what happened in Italy would become a model for what would happen later in other parts of the world. Specifically, you named Chile as one of those places. And thinking about how structural adjustment policies would disseminate in other parts of the world through global governance institutions and networks, namely, I'm thinking about IMF and World Bank. How did you explore kind of the colonial dimensions around what would happen in Italy? And I'm thinking specifically about Italy from 1936 to 1941 was holding, it had colonial engagements in Ethiopia around that time. So that's the first question. Did that offer some sort of buffer towards more extreme forms of austerity that would happen within Italy or not? And then my second question is, what is the role of global governance institutions and actors in promoting austerity today in Europe and beyond? I think about what happened in Greece around 2017 with the IMF, and maybe there are similarities and differences. And so thank you very much.
Can you go one more? Or
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Catherine, do you want to go? Yeah.
Yeah. So just quickly, how far do you feel that the COVID pandemic has acted as a global shock that equates to, say, the First and Second World War, in that the bailouts that happened then, or the money that went in, has really undermined the whole principle of austerity? And also it has given some rights, it's been the focus back to workers who really held the economy together. And so do you feel that as a crisis is a parallel, and that we could see the same, hopefully revolutionary change after that?
Thank you. Very lovely questions. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's go reverse. So clearly, the revolutionary momentum is incomparable with what was happening after the First World War. So that's why if one has the chance to read the first part of the book, it's really exciting to see really how the way people are thinking about the economy we're really kind of almost taking as a fact that the system was going to change very radically at the time. And clearly right now we are still in a different situation also in terms of the bargaining power of the workers in these Western countries that I'm analyzing in the book. This said, I do think that what's interesting to see is that with the COVID pandemic, and this is an example I usually give my students, with the state in the United States and elsewhere in the West, and also in Western Europe, has breached a limit that hadn't been breached in a very long time in giving money to people directly without having to go through the mediation of going to and selling your labor power for a wage. And this has, in fact, I think, provoked a lot of opening up of spaces for political imaginations that go beyond what we usually take for granted. So the idea that the COVID interventionism has helped repoliticize some economic institutions that we take for granted. Is definitely the case. So I think the case study I look at 100 years ago can really speak to this thing about how, people are saying, well, I had a right to live during the pandemic without having to get exploited. The reality is, for example, in the United States, that people, the poor are workers, right? It's not like the poor don't work. In the United States, workers are poor. They barely make it at the end of the month because the level of deregulation of the economy is enormous. People have very precarious work very few hours for very low wages. So the point here is that people are fed up, and this spontaneous rebellion through the fact that people are not even going to work, it's less radicalized than the union mobilization that I describe in the book, but clearly is a form of rebellion against the capital order, just by saying, I'll find another way of making a living. And it's full of this, especially I was reading articles about it, it's like especially the younger generation. It's a really big issue for the stability of the system. So this is real. The fact that people are just saying we're fed up, we don't want to be wage workers and be market dependent our lives, we'll find a way out. So this, I think, is real, and it explains why then there is such a anxiety issue from the part of experts, and that drives austerity policies in the United States in this moment. And they say it very explicitly. Again, they're not hiding it. They're just saying it. Listen, this is not okay. Imagine that 10 years ago, there were 4 people competing for 1 job opening. Now we have 2 job openings for every unemployed person in the United States. So we realize that the shift of bargaining power and the worry of the elite for this reason. So yes, so I think it is a moment in which the general ideology of how we are living in the best and only possible system is slowly breaking down. People are feeling it. I sit on my students. They come, they have to take my course. They're not even there. They have to take it mandatorily because they're enrolled in, for example, management and fashion. They take my course, and then, they're people are very radicalized just by the type of life they're living at this point. In the United States. People feel the economic violence on their own skin and have very little tools to explain what's going on because of the fact that if you study economics, then you're just studying something that has nothing to do with what you do in your daily lives. But I think that it is a moment in which podcasts are flourishing. Just to give you a sense, this book, I've been invited in so many different venues of just people organizing their own information lines and having many people participate, right? So there is all this happening. It's not talked about in the mainstream media, of course, because you don't want to give a sense that there's actually alternatives being discussed. But I think it's real. I mean, in my own personal experience, after having published this book, I've discovered worlds I wasn't aware of a lot of people actually thinking very critically still today. So that's the point. We can never take for granted capital as the social relation, and it constantly needs protection. And that's why I think we need to consider austerity in these terms. So definitely, I think there's interesting parallelism, both in terms of the spaces opening up and the austerity as foreclosing the possibility for these places right now. Okay, so then we had the question, the very important question of colonialism and even how austerity is being enforced, and all the different ways in which austerity is being enforced. So, to tell you the truth, I have not studied that specific component of fascist, of the history of fascism, because I focus mostly in the 1920s. But I could say that the colonial effort is a typical case in which the colonial effort is a typical case in which we see that austerity is never about cutting expenditures in general. It's about cutting social expenditures and then you can use, the money in the state's coffers to wage wars and expand geographically and participate in the colonial plunder. And this is what clearly Mussolini did. And it was also a way to employ the Italian population that had been suffering unemployment after Mussolini did a lot of deflation to go back to the gold standard in 1926 and 27. And actually, it is a moment in which a lot of Italians lost their jobs, and the United States had blocked the immigration flow in those years. And the reason why the colonial enterprise was popular amongst Italian people was because people were impoverished and they thought this is the new land where we can prosper. So, colonialism also acted domestically as consensus building for a better future that was clearly foreclosed by austerity. And in this, that really, of course, meant then the sacrifice of the people that were being colonized. For sure. This is just one element of a story that is much more intricate. And of course, the point is that austerity is a domino effect. You impose it on the West, but you're imposing it even more strongly on the rest. And this is very clear if we look at, for example, what's going on right now in Sri Lanka, which is devastating. Puerto Rico, all of countries that are suffering from structural austerity, but are rarely making the headlines, right? They're just kind of forgotten. So there's a lot to work on, I think, there. And then we had the two questions online, right? Or we didn't have any more. Okay, the questions online are tricky in the sense that the second one is really broad.
Yeah, I mean, you don't need, you have a lot more for the audience and you have other more specific.
So this one about the ECB is really interesting. So I must say that I read this stuff a while back when I was studying for the book, so I don't have a precise answer right now. But I would say that it goes to the crux of how the ECB, the constitution of the ECB itself kind of normalizes austerity, because it was what we were saying before, right? Once, for example, Italy joined the European Union, austerity became the European Union and the Eurozone acts as the gold standard in the 1920s. You take away monetary sovereignty from states, so that, again, going back to the question about the monetary alternatives, all you can do to be more competitive once you lost the possibility to reflate your economy is really to suppress wages, right? So clearly the thrust towards austerity that we relate to now with the 2008 crisis, for all countries that joined the Eurozone, date way back to at least the beginning of the Maastricht Treaty, and even before the Maastricht Treaty. So Maastricht Treaty is of 1992, but before that we had other treaties in that direction. And the point here is that, of course, once you cannot use monetary policy anymore as a nation state, then you're forced to work on deregulating labor relations and wage suppression, as it has been done.
Okay. We have a little bit of time, Clara, if you are okay to our last round of questions.
Yes,
yeah?
sure.
Okay, keeping strong. So, Lorenzo, you want to go first?
Thank you so much for the talk. Very interesting. My name is Lorenzo. I'm from Italy, so my question is going to be a bit Italy-centric. Sorry, guys. So I mean, it's interesting how you talk about austerity and sort of the political drive behind it. And Italy has had a history of also lots of worker-led movements. Worker-led movements, worker rights, especially kind of labor unions and all kind of these institutions. So I was wondering, how was this tension managed between austerity during, especially, for example, the years of lead, and if there was kind of that challenged the status quo enough, if that was a real challenge or not. Or
What year, sorry?
Years of lead, yani di piombo.
Okay, certo.
Unrest. And or was it kind of like, as you mentioned before, where it was kind of, you could have dissent as long as the capital order was still established, still kind of put into order? That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
thank
Then
you.
we have one more here in front. Maddie. Thank you. Here, Maddie.
Hi, I'm Giovanni. I think you'll manage to make a single answer for both of our questions. I wanted to connect to the question that was asked before about the golden age of capitalism, because you described very well how austerity is a mean to ensure wage repression and make sure that continues also so that it's a means of appeasement of labor movements, and how does that work in the case in which there is a viable alternative, which is the case of the golden age of capitalism, because it's like we want to portray it as a, let's say, a capitalism that works, though in those like from the 50s till the 70s, but it was also probably the only period that I can think of where there was a viable alternative on the other side that could, that the tool that was chosen to appease people was not a tool of austerity and of violent repression, but was a tool of welfare. And so whether this choice is also due to this fact or not.
Okay, thank you. So I will go for one or two here from our online audience. Is it okay, Clara?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there is one interesting from Steve asking you, what was the impact, if any, of the 1926 general strike on the momentum of the idea of austerity? There are quite a few questions here regarding, climate change and austerity, where capitalism should go, if you wanted to throw something regarding that. And there is there are two questions regarding more the developing world. So I think colonialism came up. So I'm gonna try one of those as well. I'm just find it here. That was quite interesting. Yeah. So there is, what about austerity as a safeguard to economic growth in developing world, particularly in India, where a large proportion of the economic existence remains informal? I think, and there is another one here, how austerity and capitalism of austerity had effects on the global south, especially countries like Pakistan, which is borrowing from IMF and the US and so on, yet, and is still on the verge of default every other decade. So I'm going to stop here. So you're going to stay for a drink a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to invite the ones in the audience just to come after Clara after that. So
I need to know it all tonight. It's like a test of my universal knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay. I can bluff a little. No, okay. 1926 strike, very quickly, is the moment in which the working classes are very emblematically defeated in the UK. So if you look at, I have the time series for the strike movement throughout the 20s, and what you see is that, of course, there is a surge in that moment in strike participation, but it's within a moment of constantly lower participation, and then it's defeated very quickly, and that's when it plummets. So it's really like the defeat of any labor mobilization in the UK. So it's important in this respect. It's interesting because in Italy, actually, what you see is that in the 70s, and this is what I take on, so chapter 10 I start with the present and I end with the present. And the idea is that chapter 10 tries to look at the major themes that have emerged throughout the story I tell about 1920s Italy and Britain, to look at how these themes constantly reappear throughout the 20th and 21st century in many different parts of the world. Of course, I pick certain cases, but I think they're themes, again, that speak more generally to different episodes that then need, of course, more specific contextualization and scholarship. But I think we can definitely see some similar outcomes. And for example, in Italy, what you see is that the 70s is another moment of enormous disorder of the capital order, right? So, it's not just the fact that there was from 1970 to 1977, there was a real wage raise of an annual average of about 7%. And the wage share had actually reached a high of 70% in 1977. So actually the bargaining power of the workers was very strong. There was also the 1977 movement was an anti-capitalist movement. We had series of very radical groups, students and workers uniting. There's a very nice book of my colleague Luca Falciola called Il Movimento del 77 that is actually describing all of the radical ideas for change that were emerging in this moment of greater politicization. And the 1970s were the moment in which the Italian workers had achieved, for example, lo Statuto dei Lavoratori, and also they had indexed wages to inflation. So there was a series of rights gained within the capitalist contract, but this was also the beginning of demands that went beyond wage relations themselves somehow. And what you see that is very fascinating, and I'm very sorry I have not really spoken enough about it, is that who does austerity? Well, Enrico Berlinguer. So we have actually supposedly the Communist Party undertaking austerity in Italy in those years, with the same rhetoric of sacrifice, collective sacrifice. There's no alternative. We need to go back to being more responsible. So it's very interesting to see how austerity, then general message is that austerity goes beyond party lines. It's not a right-wing thing, to respond also to the question on the chat. It's neither right or left. It's kind of something that seduces politicians and experts in a variety of political camps, to the point that we had a leader who was the most leftist in Italy, who really was, that's when the word austerity becomes very popular in Italy. It's associated actually with the left of Berlinguer. And this is what happens in Britain already in the 20s, is that the Labour Party becomes the austerity party. So it's very interesting for me to note how, and this is what I try to explore, is how the type of economic models that the emerging neoclassical framework diffuse are models that, of course, it's a battle within academia, and this is clear. Maffeo Pantaleoni, one of the founders of marginalism, buys Il Giornale degli Economisti with Pareto to kind of kick out the historicist school that in Italy was very prominent academia at that moment. Marginalism wasn't around, and so they make it mainstream by actually fighting off their theoretical opponents, who are either, from the classical political economy school or the historicist school that was very strong also in Germany in those years. So this academic battle went hand in hand with a battle of ideas that was diffused throughout society, and to the point that, we have all internalized that if we're poor, it's our fault. And the whole anti-waste campaign that was going on at the level of the newspapers in the 1920s was to say, again, the crisis is due to the fact that citizens are misbehaving. The motto of austerity is work more, produce less. Work more, consume less. Okay, work more, consume less. I didn't make it up. It's actually what they were constantly saying to people, is that the motto to get out of this moment of high inflation is work more, consume less. And guess what? It's exactly what we're hearing today. Even maybe not even that much more nuanced, honestly. Yes, so I think that is important, is that part of the story that we didn't have the time to talk about here is how this novel economic model really builds consensus, and how this then really has us have all a hard time thinking that there are alternatives, because in our mind, we really accept the way forward without even knowing it, right? So that's the thing. Our minds have been quite colonized by the austerity paradigm. And the attempt in this book is to start seeing austerity as it really is in order to think more freely about alternatives. Now, I have no solutions in my pockets, but I can tell you that if we take history seriously, there are many more alternatives out there than one may think. Keeping in mind that a lot of socialist countries, so-called socialist countries, realized socialism, did austerity themselves once they had to compete in a global capitalist market. So that's a couple of points there, and then just about the colonialism and the developing world. The reason why I've been very Western-centric in this book is because there's a reason, which is the following: that the argument here is that austerity serves as a protector of capitalism once capitalism is challenged somehow. And the challenge emerged in a moment of political enfranchisement of citizens in the European countries that had fought the First World War. So, I could have told the austerity story of what was happening in the colonies in Italy and Britain. I mean, austerity was being imposed already globally in the 1920s. But the point I think that is interesting is to see how it was fully codified as an active political project in a place in which citizens were demanding a greater say in the economy. Something that, of course, was not happening in places where the population was politically subjugated, as in the rest of the colonial world, right? So that's why I focus on the West, is because it was there that the calls for economic democracies were emerging. And thus you see the temporal mechanism of the origin of austerity. This said, and this is where I would like to conclude, is that it seems almost like a contradiction when I say austerity is in the DNA of capitalism, but austerity was invented in a certain moment. The reality here is what I wanted to point out is that austerity only becomes fully visible once the status quo is challenged. Austerity was already there in the 1800s with the gold standard in place and with no welfare state at all around, and with the economic decisions kept in the hands of the very few running the central banks of the world and so forth. So the point, though, is that it becomes visible as this reactionary force when there is a call for alternatives. This said, this temporal argument doesn't mean that it's not viable in other situations, because it's also a structural argument in the sense that it may well be like in Italy right now, there is no political opposition. The left is dead. It's nowhere to be seen. There's very few strikes with respect to what's happening in other countries in the north of the globe. This, I think, speaks to the fact that austerity structurally disempowers people. The level of market dependence and the precariousness that comes out of years and decades and even 100 years of curtailment of the social, of the welfare state, of deregulation of labor, precarity, etc., means that, in many cases, it's hard to fight capitalism when you depend on it for your survival, right? So the point here is that once you structurally disempower people and you colonize their minds, of course, then people go and vote for Trump or vote for whoever that then will, of course, act against their interest. But this is because austerity was very successful in fundamentally killing. Yeah. So that I think is something that it's interesting right now, because you see the effect, like the temporal association between struggles and reaction of the ECB and other financial institutions. But it's not necessarily has to be that way, I feel. It's also structurally the case that austerity has won. But I think right now, to end in a positive note, right now we are in a moment in which there is a lot of interest in really thinking ahead with a completely novel lens, and the climate catastrophe is something that, of course, I think makes it more and more obvious that we need to find solutions that are outside of the box. So I hope my book helps a little bit in that direction, at least. Okay,
Thank you, Clara.
thank you.
So thank you very much.